The silk is tightening around your wrists. Not rope. Chosen deliberately. Expensive. Smooth against the skin. It cuts circulation slowly, precisely, without tearing flesh or leaving bruises that someone might later need to explain. Silk restrains without evidence. You feel the pressure, the loss of blood, the quiet numbness creeping into your fingers. But there will be no marks to testify to what happened here. This matters. Everything in this room is designed to matter only in ways that can be documented or ignored. You are kneeling on wet stone. The floor is cold, uneven, worn smooth by time and repetition. It glistens faintly in the low lamplight, not from water, but from something thicker, darker, absorbed into the stone over years. You do not look at it too closely. You have already learned that attention is dangerous. Thinking too long about what happened here before you arrived would mean acknowledging how many others knelt in this exact place, wrists bound, breath shallow, futures already narrowing. The chamber smells of lamp oil and fear. The oil burns steadily, controlled, economical. The fear is not sharp or panicked. It hangs in the air, stale and heavy. The residue of people who have been waiting for hours, days, sometimes longer. Fear that has nowhere to go eventually settles into the body. It becomes quiet, efficient, useful. In front of you stand 3 doors. They are identical in height and width, fitted neatly into the stone wall. No markings, no symbols, nothing to suggest difference. The distinction comes from what escapes through them. Behind the first door, women are weeping. The sound rises and falls in a soft rhythm, almost patterned, almost communal. It is not screaming. It is not chaos. It is grief disciplined by exhaustion, the kind that repeats itself because it no longer expects relief. It sounds, disturbingly, like prayer. Behind the second door, there is nothing. No voices, no movement, no sound at all. The silence is not empty. It presses against your chest, heavy and total, like being held underwater just long enough to make breathing feel optional. You cannot tell whether the silence means absence or something far worse. The not knowing is deliberate. Behind the third door, there is laughter, light laughter, the soft clink of wine cups touching, calm voices discussing poetry in Arabic, a language you recognize but barely understand. The cadence is relaxed, conversational. Nothing here sounds urgent. Nothing sounds wrong. That is what unsettles you most. The normality of it. The suggestion that whatever happens beyond that door fits comfortably into the routines of ordinary life. You kneel between these sounds, bound, silent, listening. 3 doors? None of them were chosen by you. Your name is Catherine. You are 23 years old. Those facts surface now not as comfort, but as classification. Age determines elasticity. Name determines origin. Origin determines how much effort the system will invest before deciding whether you are worth keeping. 3 months ago, these details belonged only to you. Now, they belong to someone else. 3 months ago, you watched your father die. He died holding a contract he believed would save you. Not a desperate gamble, not a forged promise, but an agreement negotiated carefully over years. Your father was a merchant, a good one, the kind who understood that survival in Acre, one of the last Crusader strongholds clinging to the coast, depended on relationships that crossed battle lines. He spoke the languages of both sides. He traded with men who prayed differently from him. He believed commerce could outlast war. 6 hours before the doors, he made a calculation that would kill him. He trusted paper, wax seals, official stamps, letters written in Arabic and Latin, promising safe passage for his family and his goods when the city inevitably fell. These documents had worked before. They had protected caravans. They had opened gates. They had delayed violence long enough for negotiations to matter. He believed paper could stop steel. He was wrong. When the Mamluk armies breached the gates in the spring of 1260, those contracts dissolved like ink in water. Soldiers did not read. They did not pause. The authority your father had relied on arrived too late and in the wrong form. He died in his own courtyard, still clutching a document bearing a sultan's seal that no longer applied. Now you kneel underground, wrists bound in silk, the memory still fresh enough to ache. Damascus, 1260. The Crusades are ending. Armies withdraw. Treaties are signed. Chroniclers will later describe this moment as closure, resolution. But for the women left behind, something worse is just beginning. What follows is not chaos, but administration. Not rage, but process. A man in a spotless robe walks slowly down the line of women beside you. He asks questions in languages you know and languages you don't. His voice is calm, clinical. He does not look at you as a person. He looks at you as a set of attributes to be sorted. He is not choosing slaves. That would imply desire. What he is doing is inventory. One of these doors will determine whether you survive the next decade. One will make you wish you hadn't. And the worst one, the most destructive one, is not the door with the screams. It is the door that promises order. Because systems like this do not rely on cruelty alone. They rely on reason. What you do not understand yet is that this moment is already over. Not because a decision has been announced, but because the system you have entered does not wait for your awareness to catch up. It moves ahead of you, quietly arranging outcomes while you are still focused on survival in the present tense. The doors in front of you are not possibilities. They are confirmations. By the time this story ends, you will know what was behind all three of them. You will know which door led to exhaustion disguised as mercy, which led to disappearance mistaken for silence, and which led to something far more enduring, something that did not break the body quickly, but reshaped it slowly, methodically, until resistance became inefficient. 12 years from now, Catherine will stand in front of a sultan and speak words that should have ended her life. That fact should not make sense here. It contradicts everything this chamber represents. Women kneeling on stone floors do not address sovereign power. Enslaved women do not interrupt public audiences. Survival in systems like this depends on invisibility, not speech. And yet, that future moment is already locked into place, not because of courage or destiny, but because the system itself allows for outcomes that appear exceptional while remaining entirely consistent with its own logic. That is the deception. History teaches cruelty as spectacle. It teaches us to look for monsters, screaming guards, bloody executions, uncontrolled violence. Those things exist, but they are not what sustains power over decades. What sustains it is procedure, documentation, roles assigned and followed without question. The man walking past you believes he is being reasonable. He believes the doors represent order imposed on chaos, that women processed through them will be fed, housed, categorized, made useful. He believes inefficiency is cruelty, and that structure, however harsh, is preferable to disorder. He does not see himself as destroying lives. He sees himself as managing resources. And that belief matters more than intent, because the cruelest systems are not built by men who enjoy suffering. They are built by men who convince themselves that suffering is incidental, acceptable, necessary, temporary, a cost outweighed by stability. Damascus in 1260 is full of such men. The Crusades are ending. Chroniclers will mark this as a transition toward peace. Borders will stabilize, trade will resume. But the end of open war does not mean the end of violence. It means violence becomes organized, measured, embedded into institutions that outlive individual battles. For the women captured in its wake, the war does not end. It becomes quieter, more efficient, and far harder to escape. You are still kneeling, still listening, still waiting. The future has already decided to include you. That future, however, did not begin in this chamber. It began 6 hours earlier, in a courtyard that still felt like home. 6 hours before the doors, Catherine's father made a calculation that would kill him. It was not reckless. It was not desperate. It was the kind of decision that had sustained his family for decades. He was a merchant, and a good one precisely because he understood that survival in Ara, one of the last Crusader strongholds clinging to the coast, depended on relationships that crossed battle lines. War, he knew, was never absolute. It was negotiated daily through paper. He had contracts with Mamluk officials, letters sealed with wax and pressed with official stamps, promises written carefully in Arabic and Latin, each clause mirrored, each obligation documented. They guaranteed safe passage for his goods, protection for his household, immunity, on paper, from the worst excesses of conquest. These agreements had worked before. When borders shifted, paper had carried authority where swords could not linger. When cities changed hands, signatures had outlived banners. Merchants like Catherine's father survived not because they were loyal to one side, but because they were legible to both. He believed that states, even hostile ones, preferred predictability to chaos. He believed that the Mamluks were no different. He believed that a system built on administration would respect administration. That belief was not irrational. It was historically grounded. The Mamluk state ran on records, taxation, classification, hierarchy. It was famous for its bureaucracy. Orders flowed through documents. Property changed hands through registries. Power was enforced, but it was also documented. Paper mattered, or so it seemed. What Catherine's father did not account for was timing. Contracts operate in settled conditions. They require a moment of recognition, a pause where authority is willing to acknowledge obligation. But conquest does not pause. In the first hours after the gates fall, the system has not yet reasserted itself. Authority exists only in fragments, carried by men with weapons who have not yet been told what matters. In those hours, paper is meaningless. When Catherine's father stepped into his courtyard holding his contracts, he was not defying the conquerors. He was appealing to a version of order that had not yet arrived. He assumed that someone would read, that someone would care, that someone would say, "Yes, this applies." But the calculation failed because it was made too early. The system he trusted would eventually return. It simply would not return in time to save him. And that delay, those few hours between chaos and administration, were fatal. By the time order resumed, his death would already be recorded as an acceptable loss, a rounding error, and Catherine would be alone. When the Mamluk armies breached the gates in the spring of 1260, the distinction Catherine's father had relied upon vanished instantly. The contracts dissolved like ink in water. There was no formal declaration, no announcement that agreements were void, no moment where law visibly failed. It simply ceased to function. Soldiers poured through the streets with no obligation to read, no incentive to verify, no authority yet assigned to care. The paper Catherine's father carried was invisible to them not because it was rejected, but because it did not exist in the register that mattered. Steel had replaced administration. The men who entered Ara that morning were not there to govern. They were there to secure, to punish, to claim. Their authority was immediate and personal. It resided in weapons, not seals, in momentum, not procedure. Whatever system would later catalog bodies and assign fates had not yet taken shape. For now, there was only movement. Catherine's father stepped forward anyway. He held out the letters because that was what he knew how to do. He had survived years of instability by producing documentation at the right moment. He assumed fatally that this moment still belonged to paper, that someone, somewhere nearby, would recognize the seal, understand its implications, enforce its promise. No one did. The letters were taken from his hands and torn apart without being read. Wax seals cracked, parchment ripped, the words reduced to scraps that caught fire easily. The promise of protection burned faster than the courtyard would. The contracts did not fail because they were fraudulent. They failed because they were irrelevant. Catherine's father died where he stood. He did not run. He did not fight. He fell holding a document stamped with a sultan's seal, still expecting correction. still believing that someone would stop what was happening once the mistake was made visible. The mistake was never acknowledged. In the chaos that followed, Catherine and her mother were pulled apart. There was no deliberate separation, no decision recorded, just hands grabbing, bodies colliding, orders shouted in languages Catherine barely understood. One moment, her mother's arm was in her grasp. The next, it was gone. Different hands, different directions, different futures already forming. Catherine screamed her mother's name until her throat burned raw, until her voice broke, until sound itself felt useless. She searched faces as she was pushed forward, then backward, then sideways into a crowd that would not slow for grief. She never saw her mother again. There would be no confirmation, no record, no body to identify. Catherine would never know whether her mother survived the first hour, the first day, the first week. That uncertainty would remain permanent, an absence that could not be resolved or mourned properly. The city fell around them, and when order eventually returned, it did not return to reunite families. It returned to count what remained. She never learned whether her mother survived the first week, or the first day, or the first hour. There was no record, no message, no answer waiting to be uncovered later. The separation was not a mystery to be solved. It was a severance. Final, unacknowledged, complete. In the days that followed, Catherine stopped asking questions, not because she no longer cared, but because questions required the belief that someone might respond. 3 months passed without shape or memory. When she was finally brought into the underground chamber, the passage of time had already lost its meaning. She stood pressed against cold limestone walls with 17 other women, close enough to feel each other breathe, far enough apart to remain entirely alone. All of them were Christian. All of them had been taken during the same campaign that erased Acre from the map. Whatever identities they had once possessed, daughters, wives, merchants, children had already been stripped of practical relevance. They were no longer captives in the chaos of war. They were captives in a place designed for order. The chamber was quiet, but not empty. Silence here was controlled, maintained, intentional. It was not the absence of sound, but the suspension of it. Waiting was part of the process. Waiting softened resistance. Waiting reduced urgency to compliance. They were not told why they were there. They were not told how long they would remain. They were not told what would happen next. They did not need to be. The knowledge that something would be decided soon, definitively, without their input, hung in the air more heavily than fear ever could. This was not terror. Terror burns itself out. This was anticipation structured by power. When the center door opened, it was not dramatic. Amir Tashimore entered without weapons, without ceremony, without visible force. He wore the simple robe of a royal steward, clean and unadorned. Yet the guards shifted when he passed. They straightened. They stepped aside. Their bodies registered authority before their minds did. He did not look at the women as a group. He did not look at them as individuals either. He walked slowly down the line, stopping where he chose, asking questions in languages each woman understood. The questions were brief, functional, names, origins, ages, capabilities. He listened without expression, nodded without explanation, and moved on. Catherine understood, then, that this was not interrogation. It was processing. Whatever had happened to her family was over. Whatever violence had brought her here was finished. What replaced it was something colder, slower, and far more durable. A system had taken over. Within the Mamluk administration, Amir Tashimore's title translated roughly as Integration Specialist. Integration. The word appears frequently in surviving records. It carries a neutral tone, technical, almost benevolent. Integration suggests adjustment, accommodation, inclusion into an existing structure. It sounds like a solution rather than an act of violence. That is precisely why it was effective. Integration, in this context, did not mean acceptance. It meant conversion, not religious conversion alone, but something far more comprehensive. The systematic dismantling of an existing identity and its replacement with a new one, designed for function. Language was not culture. It was a tool. Memory was not sacred. It was an obstacle. The self was not inviolable. It was raw material. The Mamluks did not treat identity as something fixed or intrinsic. They treated it as something provisional, capable of being reshaped, given sufficient time, isolation, and control. This belief was not philosophical. It was operational. Integration specialists did not ask who a person was. They asked what a person could become. The process followed logic, not impulse. Individuals were assessed for adaptability, not loyalty. Obedience could be trained. Resistance could be eroded. What mattered was malleability, the capacity to absorb new rules, new habits, new hierarchies, without fracturing entirely. Violence, in this system, was not the primary instrument. It was inefficient. Pain was applied selectively, only when it accelerated compliance. Far more effective were repetition, routine, and environment. Time did most of the work. Silence finished the rest. What made this system especially dangerous was not its brutality, but its rationality. Every step could be justified. Every outcome could be explained. Every failure could be attributed to the subject's unsuitability rather than the system's design. Those who administered integration did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as practical. They believed they were managing resources, maintaining order, ensuring stability. Suffering was not denied, it was simply irrelevant to the metrics that mattered. This is how systems endure, not by excess, but by normalization, not by monsters, but by professionals, not by chaos, but by procedure. And for the men who operated within it, this understanding did not feel radical or experimental. It felt proven. This belief did not emerge from theory. It emerged from experience. Every man who stood at the top of the Mamluk state, every sultan, every amir, every senior commander, shaping policy and command, had once passed through the same process they now administered. They were not outsiders theorizing about control. They were its products. The Mamluk ruling class was composed entirely of former slaves. As boys, they were taken deliberately young, before loyalty had settled, before language and belief had fully hardened into identity. They came from Turkic tribes of Central Asia, from Circassian communities in the Caucasus regions, chosen not for proximity, but for distance. Distance reduced the likelihood of return. Distance weakened memory. They were purchased, transported, converted, and trained with relentless precision. Conversion was only the beginning. What followed was education engineered for obedience and competence at the same time. They learned Arabic as the language of command and administration. They memorized scripture not as devotion, but as discipline. Their days were structured, their movements regulated. Their social world narrowed until the institution itself replaced family, tribe, and past. By their late teens, they were soldiers. By their 20s, elite ones. By their 30s, commanders entrusted with armies, taxation, and governance. This was not an accident of history. It was a system refined through repetition. When the Ayyubid dynasty collapsed in 1250, it was not an aristocrat or hereditary prince who seized the Egyptian throne. It was a Mamluk, once enslaved, once trained, now fully integrated into power. His rise did not disrupt the system. It confirmed it. This produced a paradox at the heart of Mamluk society. A ruling elite whose authority rested on a process of systematic transformation they themselves had survived. They did not remember their enslavement as trauma. They remembered it as formation. What had been taken from them, family, origin, prior identity, was framed as the necessary cost of advancement. What they gained, status, command, legitimacy, was proof that the process worked. And if identity could be dismantled and rebuilt once, it could be done again. This logic mattered. It shaped how the Mamluks governed. It shaped how they viewed captives, subjects, and populations absorbed through conquest. People were not fixed categories. They were inputs. With sufficient control, time, and isolation, individuals could be remade to serve specific functions within the state. The men who believed this did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as empirical. Their lives were the evidence. Their power was the result. What they had endured, they now reproduced not as vengeance, but as policy. And that belief that transformation through control was not only possible, but reliable, would soon be applied far beyond the training grounds of slave soldiers. It would be scaled. The belief that human identity could be reshaped did not exist in isolation. It only became dangerous when it met need. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mamluk state was expanding faster than any political structure the region had known. It did not merely conquer territory. It absorbed cities, tax systems, trade networks, households, and daily life itself. An empire of this scale could not function on military victory alone. It required people, thousands of them, but not just any people. The state needed individuals with no loyalties outside the system, men and women without local kinship networks, without ancestral obligations, without memories strong enough to compete with the identities the state intended to impose. In practical terms, the Mamluks needed people who could be rebuilt from the inside out, socially, psychologically, and administratively. For men, this demand was met through the slave soldier system. Boys taken young, trained rigorously, and bound to the state through survival, advancement, and dependence. Their lives became inseparable from the institution that shaped them. Women posed a different problem. Women were not merely labor. They were infrastructure. Inside elite Mamluk households, women sustained the internal machinery of power. They managed correspondence, finances, marriage negotiations, domestic hierarchies, and the education of future generations. The men who commanded armies and governed provinces relied on a private sphere that functioned smoothly, invisibly, and without disruption. That sphere required literacy, discipline, discretion, and absolute reliability. Freeborn women of comparable status were ill-suited to this role. They had families, alliances, social leverage. They could refuse, they could negotiate, they could create political complications. Captured women could not. This is where the logic of the system closes in on itself. Enslaved women were not viewed primarily as spoils of war. They were viewed as long-term investments, assets that could be trained to fill roles. Free women could not, or would not, perform. Secretarial labor, linguistic mediation, household administration, instruction of other captives, maintenance of elite domestic order. Catherine exists precisely at this intersection of need and method. She is not retained because she is weak, nor because she is uniquely desirable. She is retained because she fits a predefined function within the state's internal economy. When Amir Tashimore stands in the underground chamber and studies the women before him, he is not asking who deserves mercy. He is asking who can be integrated with the least resistance and the greatest return. The answer does not depend on faith or character. It depends on adaptability. And once that requirement was identified, intuition and improvised violence were no longer sufficient. A state that intended to reproduce this outcome reliably needed more than judgment calls. It needed procedure. It needed records. It needed facilities. What follows is not a story of cruelty escalating. It is a story of organization. That is where the machinery begins. Once the need was identified, improvisation was no longer acceptable. A state that intended to reshape human beings reliably could not depend on battlefield chaos or individual judgment alone. It required infrastructure, repeatable processes, capable of producing the same outcomes year after year. And so the Mamluks built one. Across Damascus, a network of permanent processing facilities emerged, embedded directly into the administrative life of the city. These were not temporary holding spaces created during emergencies. They were fixed institutions, funded, staffed, and governed by standardized procedure. Surviving records document at least 7 major centers operating simultaneously, each designed to receive, evaluate, classify, and redistribute captives with bureaucratic precision. When people arrived, they were not immediately punished or sold. They were assessed. Within the first 24 hours, medical examinations were conducted. Age was estimated. Physical condition was recorded. Injuries, illness, and visible trauma were noted. Origin was documented. Literacy was tested. When relevant, these observations were not expressions of care. They were calculations. They determined projected lifespan, labor potential, and adaptability. A body unlikely to endure long-term control was inefficient. A mind judged resistant to reshaping was a liability. Assessment led directly to classification. Individuals were sorted through a structured matrix: age, gender, ethnicity, health, skills, and perceived capacity for transformation. These categories did not exist to preserve difference. They existed to optimize placement, to reduce waste, to assign each person to the role that would extract the highest return over time. Mortality was tracked statistically, not mourned. Productivity was measured. Output was compared against cost. Human beings were managed using the same logistical reasoning applied to grain storage, troop deployment, and supply chains. Records followed each captive through the system. Transfers were authorized. Reassignments were justified in writing. Movement was logged. The language of the bureaucracy was neutral, precise, and disturbingly clean. Suffering did not need to be hidden. It was simply irrelevant to the metrics that mattered. Within such a structure, violence was not the primary tool. Efficiency was. Pain was applied only when it increased compliance. Isolation was favored because it eroded identity quietly. Time did most of the work. Repetition, routine, and controlled environments produced outcomes that were predictable and reproducible. Seen from this perspective, Amir Tashimore's role becomes clear. He is not an executioner. He is not a judge. He is not even uniquely powerful. He is an administrator, one functionary inside an apparatus that has already determined the fate of every woman in that underground chamber. His task is not to decide whether they will suffer, but how. Which process yields the highest return? Which body can endure which transformation? Which identity can be erased most efficiently? By the time Catherine stands against the cold limestone wall, nothing about her fate is spontaneous. The system has already narrowed the possibilities. The only uncertainty that remains is classification. The system does not ask who she is. It asks what she can become. And once that answer is recorded, the next 12 years will unfold exactly as designed. If you found this story thought-provoking, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. History is not only about what happened, but why it mattered. Follow for more stories that explore power, fear, and the human mind.